Our second speaker is Butch Larcombe. He's a former high school social studies teacher, and he later worked for 3 decades as a newspaper reporter and editor in Montana. For 6 years, Butch was the editor and general manager of Montana Magazine and the editor of the Helena Independent Record before joining the corporate communications department at Northwestern Energy. Butch is a fourth-generation Montanan who grew up in Malta, where his family published the weekly Phillips County News for nearly 7 decades. And he's the author of Golden Kilowatts, Water Power and the Early Growth of Montana, as well as Montana Disasters, and a book called Historic Tales of Flathead Lake. Please welcome Butch. Thank you.
Thank you. As the case with Dylan, I'm really honored to be here. I've not been to the conference before, and this is just a tremendous privilege in my eyes. And I also want to compliment Dylan on her presentation. I know she's real nervous. I'm real nervous, but she did a really nice job, and so I think it's just wonderful. All right, so the dam that changed western Montana. I'm not going to dive into that, why I think that right away, but I'm going to give you some history and background on the building of the dam. All right, so this is the dam, obviously known originally as the Polson Dam. This is during the construction period before it had a formal name. In 1938, it became Kerr Dam, and it remained Kerr Dam until 2015 when it became the Salish, Kootenai, and Kootenai Dam. It's about 4.5 miles, river miles below Flathead Lake. Obviously a very scenic setting with the Mission Mountains in the background and, that beautiful water coming through and that sort of thing. This is obviously early in the year where they're spilling a lot of water, and it may have been done for photo purposes, who knows. The thing about this that you don't really realize until you go to the site is how tall the dam is. It's really actually 204 feet high, which is 54 feet higher than Niagara Falls. And you don't really get a sense of the scale of it until you see that. And I will tell you that the trip down, the Energy Keepers, the corporation that runs the dam, has done a really nice job of rebuilding the stairs down to the dam and to a very nice overlook, and it's a great spot. And that's where this picture was taken from. I will also warn you that the climb out of that spot is grueling. You'll get your cardio workout in a hurry climbing out. All right, so here's diving in. There had been proposals and talk about building a dam on the lower Flathead River, originally known as the Pend Oreille River, for many years, and there were just all sorts of people that thought that was a great idea, and this went back and forth, and the various participants were making pitches to the federal government, the Federal Power Commission at the time, and they were also talking to some of the leaders of the tribes, the chiefs, I guess. Dylan pointed out there's no organized tribal government at this point. And so they're working and they're trying to come up with this proposal, something that would be acceptable to everybody. And so this is the announcement from the Missoulian in May of 1930. And, as I've highlighted there, for a lot of the people in Polson, this was just a big, grand idea and the more greatly welcome news. This is in 1930 in Montana. A lot of times people think that depression started with the stock market crash in '29 and continued throughout most of the '30s. In Montana, really, the depression started much earlier. There was tremendous drought in the 1920s. There was all these people that came as homesteaders and weren't able to make a living. It was a tough time on the Flathead Indian Reservation, with the Allotment Act. A lot of the tribal members were not interested in being farmers. They wanted to do their hunting and gathering and subsistence lifestyle, and that just didn't fit with them. And so when the allotment kind of put them in tough shape, and so by the time this announcement rolls around, it's pretty welcomed by a lot of people. One thing, I don't know if you can read this in the story, but one of the contentious issues was how much that Montana Power would pay to lease the land where the dam was located. And if you read it there, it's down there, it's about $2.845 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but that's over a 20-year period. So if you average it out, it's about $142,000 a year for the right to use this land that doesn't belong to them. All right, so we're moving ahead towards the official groundbreaking, and this shows you the canyon where the dam was located. This is, again, the Pend Oreille River, now known as the Lower Flathead River. One thing that I want you to take away from this is that there are differing views based on cultural background and whatever on how all this took place, and this demonstrates it. To the tribal members, and whether it was the Pend Oreille or the Salish or the Kootenai or whoever, and probably people before them, this has always been a sacred place. I'm told that there is a series of Indian pictographs on the walls there in the dam that are hard to access, but you could see them before they built the dam. It just shows you how narrow this canyon is, and they referred to it as the place of falling water, which makes sense. Moving on to Mr. Elrod, as Dylan has talked about, he's a complicated guy, or was a complicated guy. You know, he had a great appreciation for nature. He was a naturalist in Glacier National Park and took all sorts of photos. Some of his early photos are actually part of the early photographic record of the glaciers that they use as a baseline to see how much they shrunk. So here he's talking about this series of rapids of wondrous beauty, and also noting that this would be a great place to build the dam. And so it's just full of conflict here. So I want to talk, they had a media event, and I'll propel ahead a little bit here, but this photo is by a guy by the name of Herman Schnitzmeyer, who is a very interesting character and a little bit of a diversion, but Schnitzmeyer came to the Flathead in 1910. He was one of the people that won a lottery to claim a homestead on the Flathead Indian Reservation. He chose to choose his spot on Wild Horse Island. And so he goes out to Wild Horse Island. He's on and off the island. He builds a home out there, and he's going to lead this idyllic life. He's going to raise crops, and he's going to just do whatever. And Schnitzmeyer is a real enigmatic character, to say the least. He was sort of a philosopher and that sort of thing. And this didn't work out for him. But in the winter of 1913-14, he spent the whole winter on Wild Horse Island, and he's probably the only human occupant of the island. And by the time he's done, he reports almost starving to death, and he ends up going on and opening up a photo studio in Polson. But he was a horrible businessman. He's a very skilled photographer. His technical skills are great, and his compositional skills were really good. But he was a horrible businessman. He'd make appointments for portraits, and then he wouldn't show up. He'd leave people standing at his office door, and he wanted to be out wandering around the Mission Valley and around everywhere and taking photos. And he ended up getting out of the studio business wisely. He sold it to a guy by the name of Louis Desch, but then he went as a contract photographer and working for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and traveled over much of Montana and into Washington State and around the Northwest. When he was in Polson, he developed a reputation for being a very enthusiastic eater. When he would be in Polson, he apparently had a reputation for going up and down the main street and having 2 or 3 breakfasts back to back in the morning. He hired a kid, a young guy, to drive him around the Mission Valley while he'd be out taking pictures. And a lot of times he'd want to stop at a farmhouse. He'd go up and knock on the door and say, I'll take a picture of your farm home here if you'll feed me lunch. So he's very food motivated. It could have been his time on Wild Horse Island, and maybe not. Well, anyway, fast forward, he does work for the Northern Pacific for a while. He ends up in Missoula. He has a little bit of fame. He did a big exhibition at the university. He had 200 photos and that sort of thing, and got some acclaim, but then he sort of faded away. He ended up living in an apartment down by the Milwaukee Depot, and he died even though he weighed 300 pounds, he died of malnutrition. He had such a poor diet. Apparently he was just drinking like old milk and bread, that was his diet for the time. And they buried him at public expense in a Missoula cemetery, and when they're lifting the casket into the grave, the handles break off because he's so heavy. From this guy that almost starved to death on Wild Horse Island. So, anyway, moving on. So another photographer at this media event in 1931 was Owen Smithers, who was a pretty well-known butte photographer, and he was hired by the Montana Power Company to document a lot of things. A lot of the photos I'll show you are Smithers photos. But this is I included the names because they're kind of important to me, but from left to right is a guy, a Kootenai man by the name of Jim Kilowatts, and he is actually an interpreter. He spoke English, and he was an interpreter for Custata, who I'll point out to you later. Then it's Baptiste Matthias, who was a Kootenai sub-chief. Willie Julian, I don't know about Willie. Then it's Martin Charlot, who's kind of partially obscured, the shorter guy there behind this animal hide. And then it's Custata, the Kootenai chief. The blurry guy is Victor Vanderberg, and he's a Salish man, a prominent Salish leader. And then Pierre Magpie Cap, and he was a tribal judge of some sort, but I don't really know much more about him. So what they're doing is they're inducting Frank Kerr, the president of the Montana Power Company, as an honorary member of the tribe, of the Kootenai tribe. They give him a name. His name is the Light, based on what they expect to come from the building of the dam. You can't see it in this photograph, but there are other versions of this where there's actually Montana Power had hired a movie photographer there too. So this truly was a big photo op media event, kind of hyping this idea that they're going to build this dam and everybody's going to be better off because of it. So this is a big project. Obviously, it's a big industrial project in the dam. This is just a few things. The things, obviously the dam's still there. A lot of the buildings in the photo on the right, that the village essentially that was built down in the river bottom are gone. There are some of the buildings that are still down there, some of the houses and stuff like that, and they're still used by energy keepers at this point. But this shows you how narrow the canyon is. And somebody was asking me yesterday when we were out at Holter Dam about how they chose dam sites. Well, they would like to pick a spot where the canyon is narrow. I mean, it's less dam you have to build. And obviously, the pace of the water through there is also going to be greater, so it has better hydropower potential. And just more construction photos. I mean, these are Smithers. I mean, these are obviously for the benefit of Montana Power. I want to back up just a little bit here. I kind of skipped over something. So in this event, they're doing this, but, it kind of implies that there's a warm welcome for the Montana Power Company on the reservation. Well, it turns out there's really radically different views. A lot of the traditional tribal people were very concerned about the dam. They didn't feel like that they'd been well informed about its impact, and they weren't really receptive to this. On the other hand, there were people that in the tribes that were welcoming this. I mean, but in a video that was done by Thompson Smith, who's a Salish Pend Oreille tribal historian, and a guy by the name of Roy Big Crane, also a historian. They did a three-part video documentary called The Place of the Falling Waters. And this, you can watch it on YouTube, but one of the things that strikes me there is they interviewed people that were around during this period, and they had people tell them that they saw Frank Kerr hand money to tribal leaders, obviously trying to grease the skids for approval to the dam. Whether that's actually true, I've run that by some other more current people at Energy Keepers and other places, and they're not sure that happened. But Frank Kerr was a very frequent visitor to the reservation in this period before they got approval. They would bring food for people and have these gatherings, and he would be out talking to people and just trying to present this very friendly face. So, this is kind of one version of it, but in the background and the subtext of it, it was a little more complicated. All right. So they started work on the dam in 1931, but it wasn't very long, and they quit building the dam. The country went deeper into the Depression, and the Montana Power Company decided to pull the plug, at least temporarily, in part because the Anaconda Company was going to be their biggest customer, and for the electricity that would be produced there, Anaconda was seeing reduced demand. Everybody's concerned about the economic conditions. The Depression is deepening, and so they pull the plug. And also in the background, the things that went on, Anaconda and Montana Power were kind of corporately intertwined for a number of years. But in 1928, John D. Ryan, who ran both companies sold the Montana Power Company along with the approval of shareholders to American Power and Light, which was a big national sort of a holding company of all sorts of utilities. So in 1928, he got $82 million from Montana Power in 1928. But as you all know, that if you ever worked for a corporation of any sort, they're fairly risk averse. And I can imagine American Power and Light was not real excited about dumping money into this dam project with the uncertainty of the Depression. So jumping ahead, though, in 1936, with $5 million of Works Progress Administration money, New Deal money, they restart the project, and the idea was, well, we want to build the dam, we can use the electricity, but more importantly, we need to provide jobs for people. And that was the case. I mean, and there was plenty of demand for jobs among both the white folks and the indigenous folks. Times were tough across much of Montana, especially on the Flathead Reservation. So they're going full steam trying to get the dam done. They're working 24 hours a day, multiple shifts. And they were good jobs. I mean, 40 cents an hour to $2 an hour. To put that in perspective, I did used a little AI yesterday. If you made $2 an hour and you work a little over 2,000, essentially what we consider full-time work now, that was about $4,000 a year in 1936. In current wages, it's about $102,000 a year. So if you were making $2 an hour, you were doing pretty well. Most people didn't make $2 an hour. And this was backbreaking work, a lot of just using picks and shovels, loading stuff into wheelbarrows. They're down at the bottom of the canyon, and here's what's going on. I mean, you can see a few people in the back with hard hats. The people up front are not wearing hard hats. The worker safety was not a big priority during the Depression, unfortunately. I mean, I think there was an actual disregard for human life to a certain extent. So there were people that died in the building of the dam, 15 total. Of those 15, I think all but 2 were tribal members. The way they died, the first deaths were a tunnel collapse. Even before they started work on the actual dam, they were building a diversion tunnel. The tunnel collapsed, people were trapped and killed, a couple guys. Another way they died, there was a rail spur that went from up on top and down into that area that brought coal and supplies down for construction. The train derailed one winter morning. It's carrying a bunch of coal, and most of the people on the train were able to jump off, except for a couple guys that got stuck on the train. They were buried in the coal and were killed there. But then in March of 1937, when this headline is where it's from, they're working at night, they're down at the bottom of the canyon, there's a big rock fall, and it just buries these 7 workers under tons and tons and tons of rocks. It took them days to excavate the bodies. At some point, they used dynamite to blow up the rocks so they could see if they could find the bodies. And that was the most deadly incident. There were a few later, and resulting in 15 deaths. This became, when you talk to some of the Salish folks and the tribal leaders today, the deaths on the reservation during the dam building period were part of the motivation for them wanting to take further control of the dam. And I just talked to the head of Energy Keepers last week, and he's told me that they are working on a memorial there that they'll add to honor those people that died, which I think is very appropriate. So we're getting close to completion. You can kind of get the lay of the land here. You can see the dam, and then around the river kind of goes around the corner, and that's where the powerhouse is. You can just see the steepness of the canyon. And that picture I showed you earlier where all those houses and buildings were, they're off to the right, out of this frame, but that's kind of the location. It's obviously the dam looks pretty complete, but there's no water in the river. They're still diverting water, so this is close to the end of the construction period. When they announced the dam, they made this claim that this was going to be the largest construction project in western Montana history. I think that's dubious. It's obviously a big project. They're up to 1,200 workers working there at one point, but you think about other projects. Think about the building of the Anaconda smelter, or the lumber mills in, east of Missoula in the Bonner area, or even though they weren't done all at once, just the mining facilities and infrastructure in Butte. So it seems like a kind of a boosterish claim, and I think newspapers were kind of full of that at the time. So we're advancing ahead to 1938. We're at the dedication of the dam. It's big news across the state. It was front page news in all the state's newspapers, which, again, understanding a little bit about who owned the newspapers at that time. The Anaconda Company owned most of the daily newspapers in the state at the time, and they were going to be a beneficiary of this power. So this is, again, part of them making themselves look good when the people are already fairly suspicious of them. But I thought, this is going to be good for the red man and the white man. It's kind of interesting, and it's kind of shows this differing view of the world. And then I also will point out that I think they got their photo IDs wrong. I don't think it's not Custada on the left, he's on the right, and it's not Chief Charlo, I think that's Baptiste Matthias actually on the left there, just as a historical point. So at the dedication, they did all sorts of things. There was dancing, and they roasted buffalo from the bison range, and the Polson City Band played, and of course, there were politicians there. The governor was there, Burton K. Wheeler was there, all sorts of speeches. And there were two speeches that stood out to me in the news accounts from that time. One is from Con Kelly, president of the Anaconda Company. He went just way overboard in praising Frank Kerr about what a wonderful thing he'd pulled off building this dam. And the key things in those comments are the words, this water is being wasted in the Cascades and Falls of the river, and that it's better to use it for industrial purpose and social service. So that's kind of how his view, that's the industrialist view of it. Custada, on the other hand, speaking through an interpreter, describes it a little bit differently. Essentially that we're going along with this, we're going to make the white people happy, and hopefully we'll get some money out of it. And that is kind of a pervasive view, and you can still find that today, where there's that kind of dichotomy in how they view this whole thing. All right, so we're fast forwarding to 2015. So the dams in Montana that are owned by Montana Power and all across the country, the big hydroelectric dams, are all licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And that license expired in 1985. It was really a contentious period. The tribal members thought they should be getting more money for land rental payments. In 1985, the annual payment was about between $2 and $3 million a year. They thought they deserved way more. They brought in an arbitrator who told them that they should be getting at least half the sales, essentially half the money generated by the dam in a year, which would have put it at 15 or 18 million. They agreed to take $9.5 million in a land rental payment in exchange for a couple things. One, they asked for the right to be named a co-licensee with Montana Power and the dam. And two, more importantly, they essentially reserved the option to buy the dam when the license expired in 2015, 30 years down the road. There was no guarantee. They had to come up with the money. It wasn't going to be given to them. They had to come up with the money, and there was no set price, but they determined then that that was their goal, and they were motivated by what they thought was the lack of consideration of their wishes in the building of the dam, by the deaths in the dam, and then the lack of getting their fair share of the economic benefit. And so they went ahead and did it, and it was great. They paid $18.2 million for the dam. I think most people would tell you that they got a pretty good deal, but maybe they deserved it. Who knows? And then they renamed the dam, obviously. So when I pitched this story idea to Christine, I opened my big mouth and said it's going to be how the dam changed western Montana. I may have overpromised and probably have underdelivered here a little bit, but here's my attempt at my rationalization. So, well, one, it changed western Montana in a geographic way. They put this big giant slab of cement in a sacred spot in a very pretty river canyon. I mean, that's something that cannot be undone. Number two, It helped Western Montana in the sense that it brought jobs to all sorts of people that really needed them during the late 20s and early 1930s and through the Depression. And, it probably saved lives, so that's a benefit, I would say. It changed the reservation economy dramatically, as Dylan pointed out, a lot of the tribal folks were hunting and gathering, they were fishing, they were growing subsistence crops, and they shared land communally, and the idea that you would go get a job and be paid a wage was a new concept to them. And so essentially, when they would get these jobs at the dam, even if they were making 40 cents an hour, it accelerated the development of a money-based economy on the Flathead Reservation. All right, number 4, building the dam propelled the formation of a tribal government on the reservation. As Dylan pointed out, until 1934, with the Wheeler-Howard Act, which is more formally known as the Indian Reorganization Act, they really didn't have any tribal government. Montana Power negotiated with Custata and Martin Charlo and some other tribal leaders. And they didn't have any real decision making, and the government didn't grant them the right to have any sort of self-determination. Well, that was broadened greatly in 1934, and I am told, and I haven't absolutely verified this, that because of this period, that the Salish and Kootenai became the first tribes in the country to form their own tribal government as allowed by the Indian Reorganization Act. All right, number 5. So the way the dam works is that the energy keepers, the tribal corporation, is allowed to control the top 10 feet of the lake elevation. And this gets really sticky. But in doing that, they raise it up in the summer. They start raising. They draw it down in the fall in anticipation of runoff and that sort of thing in the spring, and they slowly bring it up through the spring and then get it. Their idea under the requirement under the license to have it at full pull by mid-June, which is 2893. So the lowest they can take it is 2883. So this idea of raising the dam up and keeping it full pull through the summer is a big boon to recreation on the lake. It makes it much more viable to have a boat. If you drive around Flathead Lake now, you see docks all over, but if the lake's 10 feet lower, you've got a lot more rocky shoreline to even get any sort of boat into the water. It just wasn't I'm not saying that the people didn't use the lake before that, they certainly did, but it was a big boost to lakefront homes and that sort of thing, and a big boost to recreation. And it probably really spurred the, kind of all the private real estate development that we've seen over the decades around Flathead Lake. And the last one, and this is where I want to leave you, that the dam continues to be a source of conflict and misunderstanding. So the last 3 summers have been pretty dry years, or last 3 years have been pretty dry in northwest Montana. Snowpack's been low. The amount of runoff coming out of Glacier National Park and Bob Marshall and coming down the 3 forks of the Flathead River into Flathead Lake has been diminished. And sometimes they'll have a good snowpack but it melts out very early. It'll melt out in March and April rather than extending into June and July. So the level of the lake has become a very contentious issue at times. There's all sorts of nonprofit groups have been formed that essentially the lakefront property owners are up in arms about not being able to use their boats all summer, or why does the lake have to be drawn down and that sort of thing. And this is, and it's kind of been exacerbated by the fact that in the eyes of some that, well, how come the indigenous people are in charge of this? How come we can't go back to when Montana Power ran the dam and everything was hunky-dory, which it wasn't. Montana Power raised and lowered the lake with impunity for decades. But this goes on, and you read in social media posts and some of the things that get said about the operators of the dam and the tribal ownership and just this general disregard for anybody's interests other than their own. It's really discouraging. And this has gone on in various forms for quite a while. And with climate change and that sort of thing, I suspect it's going to continue to go on. So those are my claims. I'm open to other ideas, and I appreciate your interest today, and thanks for coming to the conference.